Chapter 1. A Desperate Request. The Navarra starport was a place where wealth and ruin walked side by side, where corporate executives with polished cybernetic implants passed by traders who counted every last credit chip, and where smugglers parked their ships next to tourists who had no idea how close they were to getting swindled. It was a city in space, built on deals, desperation, and the illusion of opportunity. Ethan Cole had seen it all. He was one of the few human mechanics in this sector, and his repair bay Cole Starship Maintenance was one of the last privately owned shops in a port where most repairs were done by cold, corporate-owned AI drones. That meant he got two kinds of customers: those who didn't trust machines and those who couldn't afford corporate rates. Tonight, he wasn't in the mood for either. 12 hours of back-breaking work had left his hands aching and his patience thin. He had spent the entire day repairing a merchant freighter's faulty reactor core, only to realize that the problem wasn't in the core itself, but in a misaligned power relay that some half-trained dockworker had patched together with stolen parts. Now, his face was streaked with oil and frustration, his jumpsuit covered in engine grease, and his only real decision was whether he should grab a stiff drink at the nearest dive bar or collapse into bed and let sleep take him first. That's when he saw her. She stood at the entrance of his repair bay, hesitant, shifting awkwardly, her long blue fingers twisting together in what looked like a nervous habit. She was definitely alien, that much was obvious from the soft lavender hue of her skin, the silver glow of her large eyes, and the set of small, retractable fins along the sides of her head that flickered as if reacting to her emotions. Her clothes were simple, a little too worn to be fashionable, but not in a way that suggested she was homeless. More like someone who had run out of better options. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Shop's closed for the night," he said, wiping his hands on a grease-stained rag. She took a small step forward. "Please, I need help." Something in her tone made Ethan pause. This wasn't the usual, "I need a quick fix, but I don't want to pay full price" request. He'd heard that scam before. No, this was something else. There was a quiet desperation in her voice, a kind of hopelessness that only came from someone with nowhere else to turn. Still, Ethan wasn't in the habit of fixing ships for free. He let out a breath, rubbing the back of his neck. "What kind of help are we talking about?" She hesitated for a moment, then squared her shoulders and met his gaze. "My ship," she said. "It's broken. The power core is failing, and I think there's a leak in the primary fuel lines." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "That's a hell of a lot of problems." She swallowed. "I know. That's why I need help." Ethan sighed, already knowing where this was going. "All right, bring it in tomorrow. I'll run a diagnostic, and we'll talk about the cost dash." "I don't have any credits." The words hit like a dead thruster in deep space. Ethan frowned. "Then how exactly do you expect me to help?" She shifted again, her fins twitching nervously. "I'll find a way to pay you," she said quickly. I don't have anything right now." Ethan ran a hand down his face. Of course, she had no credits. This was the outer reaches. People were always trying to get something for nothing. He opened his mouth to tell her no, but then he noticed something. There was a faint, burnt smell clinging to her clothes, and not the kind that came from just standing near a starship all day. It was the sharp, metallic scent of plasma burns. Her sleeves had small scorch marks, barely noticeable unless you were looking. And her hands? Her hands had tiny tremors, the kind that only happened when someone had been too close to an explosion. Ethan had seen it before. This wasn't just some random ship failure. Something had gone very wrong. And this woman, whoever she was hiding it. Ethan exhaled. "What's your name?" The woman hesitated. Then, quietly, she said, "Lyra." Ethan folded his arms. "All right, Lyra. Tell me the truth. What happened to your ship?" She hesitated again, and for a second, Ethan thought she wouldn't answer. Then, finally, she let out a breath. I was fired," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I worked as a receptionist for the Vandros Trading Guild. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid for my docking fees. Then, today, they just let me go. No warning. Just told me to leave." Ethan frowned. The Vandros Guild was one of the biggest corporate trading firms in this sector. They didn't just fire people at random. Lyra continued. "I went back to my ship, but when I powered it on, something was wrong. The system started sparking, and then there was Dash," she swallowed. An explosion. I barely got out before the power core started failing. Ethan narrowed his eyes. It didn't add up. Ships didn't just explode unless something had been tampered with. And if the Vandros Guild had fired her right before her ship nearly killed her, that wasn't a coincidence. Ethan sighed. You think someone sabotaged you? Lyra's fins flickered in agitation. I don't know. Maybe. All I know is that I have nothing left. No job, no home, and if my ship dies, I'm stranded. Ethan let out a long breath, staring at her for a moment. He knew this was a bad idea. He didn't know her anything. But something about the way she looked at him like she was barely holding it together made it impossible to say no. He rubbed his face, already regretting what he was about to say. All right, he muttered. I'll take a look at your ship. Lyra's eyes widened in shock. You will? But, Ethan said, holding up a hand, you're gonna work for it. No credits? Fine. You help me out in the shop while I fix your ship. Deal? She hesitated for only a second before nodding quickly. Deal. Ethan sighed. He had no idea what he had just gotten himself into. But something told him this was just the beginning. Chapter 2. Beneath the Surface. The Navarra Starport Repair Bay was one of the last places in the galaxy that still had the scent of oil, plasma fumes, and hard work. Most mechanics had been replaced by corporate AI service stations. But here where the smell of burning circuits and coolant leaks filled the air, things were done the old-fashioned way. Lyra stood awkwardly beside Ethan as he cracked his knuckles, rolling his shoulders before stepping up to her damaged ship. It was worse than he expected. The vessel, a small Zyron-class freighter, wasn't just battered from age. It looked like someone had ripped out its guts and tried to patch it back together with cheap parts. And then, of course, there was the burn damage. Ethan crouched beside the primary access panel, running his fingers along the charred metal plating. The explosion Lyra had described hadn't been an accident. This wasn't the result of old components failing. It was deliberate. Someone had rigged the power core to overload. And if she hadn't gotten out in time, she would have been nothing but ash. Ethan exhaled slowly, glancing at Lyra out of the corner of his eye. All right, he muttered, standing up. I'm gonna need you to be honest with me. Lyra's silver eyes flickered with confusion. I told you everything I know. Maybe, Ethan said, but this wasn't just a bad system failure. Someone did this on purpose. Lyra stiffened. Ethan watched her carefully. You got any enemies I should know about? She shook her head quickly. No, I was just a receptionist. I didn't do anything important. Ethan snorted. Yeah? Well, someone thought you were important enough to blow you to hell. Lyra bit her lip, clearly struggling to process the weight of what he was saying. I don't know, she said finally. The Vandros Guild didn't give me a reason when they fired me. Just told me to leave. Then my ship almost kills me? It doesn't make sense. Ethan sighed. All right, here's what we're gonna do. I'll fix your ship, but while I'm at it, I'm gonna find out who sabotaged it. Lyra blinked. Wait, you don't have to dash. I know, Ethan muttered, grabbing a plasma torch from his workbench. But I don't like people getting away with blowing up innocent mechanics. He turned back to the ship, rolling up his sleeves. Now, he said, igniting the torch with a sharp hiss, let's get to work. Deeper than expected. Ethan started with the primary power core housing, prying open the damaged plating to get a better look at the internal circuits. Lyra stood beside him, watching closely, and to his mild surprise, she seemed genuinely interested. You ever worked on a ship before? He asked. She shook her head. No, I always liked watching the tech teams when they did maintenance at the guild. Ethan smirked. Well, you're about to get a crash course. As he worked, he explained what he was looking at, walking her through the different parts of the ship's core system, how the power conduits fed into the stabilizers, how the fuel regulators balanced the flow, and why a malfunction in one area could cause catastrophic failures elsewhere. Lyra listened carefully, asking the occasional question, and Ethan almost forgot that she was a runaway receptionist and not an actual apprentice. Then, his hand brushed against something wrong. Ethan frowned, reaching deeper into the core housing. His fingers found a thin, metallic device lodged between two power couplings. It was small, almost invisible to the untrained eye. A disruptor node? Ethan's stomach twisted. This wasn't just sabotage. This was an assassination attempt. Someone had installed the disruptor to trigger an energy cascade failure, making it look like a random system malfunction. The explosion had been designed to kill whoever was on board, and it had almost worked. Ethan slowly pulled the device free, turning it over in his hands. The make was corporate standard, the kind used by high-end security firms and private mercenary outfits. He glanced at Lyra. "You sure you don't have any enemies?" Lyra looked at the disruptor in his hand, and for a second, she looked genuinely scared. "I swear," she whispered, "I don't know anything." Ethan exhaled sharply. Then whoever did this wasn't after her personally, which meant they were covering something bigger. Ethan turned back to the ship, scanning the interior for anything else out of place. If someone had planted a bomb, they might have left other surprises. That's when he saw it. Tucked behind a loose data panel, barely visible, was a data drive. Someone had hidden it there, and Ethan had a strong feeling that it wasn't just spare navigation logs. "Lyra," he muttered, reaching for the drive. "What exactly did you do for the Vandros Guild?" She hesitated. Then, finally, she said, "I handled scheduling, incoming and outgoing shipments." That's it. Ethan stared at the data drive. If this was just shipment logs, then why had someone gone through the trouble of trying to kill her to erase it? His gut told him that this was way bigger than just a bad termination. He glanced at Lyra. "You ever think maybe you saw something you weren't supposed to?" Lyra's expression darkened, and Ethan knew, right then and there, she had. She just didn't realize it yet. What happens next? Ethan finished repairing the ship's power core, replacing the damaged couplings, and removing the sabotaged components. But his mind was elsewhere. That data drive was too important to ignore. And if the Vandros Guild was willing to kill to make sure no one saw it, then whatever was on it was worth more than a starship full of credits. Ethan turned to Lyra, tossing her a rag to clean her hands. "I fixed your ship," he said. "But now you and I need to figure out what's on this thing." Lyra swallowed hard. "And if it's something dangerous?" Ethan smirked. "Princess, I think we're already in trouble." Lyra blinked. "I'm not a princess." Ethan chuckled. "You act like one." Lyra huffed. "You're impossible." Ethan grinned. "And you're stuck with me." Lyra sighed but didn't argue. She took a deep breath, looking at the data drive like it was a ticking bomb. Then, finally, she said, "All right, let's find out what I almost died for." Chapter 3. The Truth Buried in the Code. The Navarra starport was rarely quiet. Even in the late hours of the artificial night cycle, the station buzzed with activity dock workers moving cargo, smugglers negotiating deals in shadowed corners, and travelers shuffling through neon-lit corridors. But in the dimly lit repair bay where Ethan worked, the noise of the outside world felt distant. Everything had shrunk down to one screen, one data drive, and one mystery. The decryption module hummed softly, working through the firewalls and encryption layers on the small metallic drive Ethan had pulled from Lyra's ship. Ethan sat forward, elbows resting on the scarred workbench, eyes locked onto the scrolling lines of fragmented code. Beside him, Lyra hovered anxiously, her silver eyes darting between him and the slowly unraveling data. It had been hours since they started this. Hours of decrypting, bypassing security locks, and watching as the truth slowly emerged from the corrupted files. And the deeper Ethan dug, the more he realized this wasn't just shipment data. This was something much, much bigger. Not just cargo. Ethan frowned, scrolling through the first unlocked segments of data. "You told me this was just logistics work, right?" he asked, glancing at Lyra. She nodded hesitantly. "That's all I ever saw. Cargo shipments, fuel supply reports, transport schedules. Nothing classified." Ethan exhaled slowly, drumming his fingers against the workbench. "Then explain this." He turned the screen toward her. Lines of shipment records filled the display, but instead of listing crates, machinery, or fuel reserves, the manifest contained names. People's names. Lyra's eyes widened. These aren't supply logs." "No," Ethan muttered. "They're passenger lists." A cold silence settled between them. Ethan's gut twisted. He had seen plenty of shady deals in his years working the outer reaches, but this was human trafficking. Or, in this case, sentient trafficking. He scrolled through the entries, each one detailing the transport of individuals from one system to another. And it wasn't just criminals or exiles. Some of these people were scientists, engineers, political officials, people who were supposed to be protected by intergalactic treaties. And yet, they had been secretly moved under the Vandros Guild's control, erased from public records. Holy shit, Ethan muttered. Lyra shook her head in disbelief. This doesn't make sense. Why would the Vandros Guild be involved in something like this? They're just a trading company. Ethan let out a dry chuckle. Yeah, and I'm the Emperor of Earth. Lyra didn't respond. She just stared at the names, her breath coming quicker, shallower. Because then, Ethan reached the last page of the document, and that's when everything changed. The last name on the list. Ethan froze. His eyes locked onto the final name on the passenger manifest, and for a second, the only thing he could hear was his own heartbeat. Lyra's name was on the list. Her full name, Lyra Navarra. Passenger status, priority transfer. Destination, undisclosed. Current status, processing, departure pending. Ethan turned to Lyra, but she had already gone pale. That's me, she whispered. Ethan leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. This wasn't just some random conspiracy. Lyra was never supposed to leave the Vandros Guild. They hadn't just fired her. They had planned to make her disappear, and she had no idea why. Too close to the truth. Lyra took a step back from the screen, her hands trembling. I don't understand, she murmured. I was just a receptionist. Why would they dash? She stopped. Something clicked in her expression. Ethan noticed immediately. What is it? Lyra hesitated. Then, finally, she spoke. There was an incoming shipment, just a few days before they fired me, she said slowly. It came through an unauthorized route, and I remember asking my supervisor about it. Ethan frowned. And? Lyra swallowed. He told me to forget I saw it. Ethan exhaled sharply. And you didn't? Lyra looked away. Thought I flagged it for review. Ethan let out a low whistle. You flagged it? Lyra nodded, looking suddenly nauseous. I didn't think much of it at the time. I thought it was just a clerical error. Ethan chuckled dryly, shaking his head. Yeah, well, turns out you tripped an alarm you weren't supposed to. Lyra's breathing quickened. This means they were planning to dash. Make sure you never asked questions again? Ethan finished for her. Yeah, that's what it means. A choice that changed everything. Ethan closed the data terminal, rubbing his temples. This was way bigger than he had signed up for. Fixing a broken ship? Sure. Getting involved in a corporate conspiracy that involved sentient trafficking and assassination attempts? Not exactly what he had on his to-do list. But now, he had a choice. He could walk away. Lyra wasn't his problem. He had fixed her ship, found out why she was targeted. If she wanted to run, she could. But as he looked at her standing there, shaken, but not broken, he knew he wasn't going to. All right, Ethan muttered. Standing up, here's what we do next. Lyra looked at him, still rattled. Next? Ethan grabbed his jacket. Yeah, you think I'm just letting this go? Lyra blinked. You're staying? Ethan smirked. Damn right I am. Lyra hesitated. Then, slowly, she let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. Thank you, she whispered. Ethan shrugged. Don't thank me yet. We're about to piss off a lot of people. Lyra exhaled, steeling herself. Then let's do it right. And just like that, they weren't just fixing a ship anymore. They were about to tear open a secret that was never meant to see the light of day. Chapter 4. A Reckoning in the Stars. The Navarra starport had always been a place where secrets lived and died in the shadows. Deals were struck in dimly lit alleys, fortunes were won and lost in the span of a single transaction, and power belonged to those who knew how to manipulate information, not just weapons. Tonight, Ethan and Lyra had become part of a game much larger than themselves, one where the stakes were far beyond credits or repairs. They weren't just trying to fix a ship anymore. They were trying to survive. And more than that, they were about to expose a truth that was never meant to be seen. No more running. Lyra's ship, now fully repaired, sat in the docking bay, its systems humming with renewed life. Ethan had worked tirelessly for the past 12 hours, patching up wiring burns, fuel leaks, and power core instabilities, making sure the ship wouldn't just fly, but outrun anything that came after them. And something was coming after them. The moment Ethan had pulled that data drive from the ship's console, He had known. This wasn't just about a corporate dispute or some disgruntled ex-employee. This was Vandross trying to erase something they never should have let slip. And the moment Lyra's name had appeared on that list, they had marked her for death. Ethan sat at his workbench, staring at the terminal screen where the decrypted files still flickered in the dim light. There was no turning back now. Lyra stood beside him, arms crossed, her face tight with thought. She hadn't spoken in a while. She was thinking, processing, realizing just how deep this went. Finally, she exhaled. "We can't just run, can we?" Ethan shook his head. "We could. But they'd never stop hunting you." She nodded slowly. "Then we fight back." Ethan let out a short, humorless laugh. "That's the spirit." She shot him a look. "I'm serious." "So am I." He turned toward her fully. "You realize what this means, right? If we send this data out, we're not just going to be a couple of people running from some corporate thugs. We're going to be enemies of the entire Vandross Guild." Lyra lifted her chin slightly, something determined settling into her expression. "I'd rather be hunted for the truth than live as a target in the dark." Ethan studied her for a long moment. She had changed in the last 24 hours. She wasn't just some desperate woman looking for a mechanic anymore. She had seen the truth, and now, she was ready to fight for it. He sighed, cracking his knuckles. "All right, princess. Let's make some noise." The broadcast. They needed a way to send out the evidence, but Navarra Starport was under constant surveillance. Every major corporation had its fingers in the communications hub, and any outgoing message could be traced, intercepted, or wiped before it even reached a second system. So they needed something faster, something impossible to stop. Ethan tapped at his console, pulling up a pirate relay network, one of the oldest tricks in the book. Hyperpulse echo transmission. It was a method used by smugglers and underground whistleblowers, a way to send out information simultaneously to hundreds of receivers across the galaxy before any single authority could shut it down. "Once I push send," Ethan muttered, fingers hovering over the final command. "There's no undoing this. Everyone's gonna see it: law enforcement, mercenary syndicates, rival corporations, bounty hunters." Lyra took a deep breath. She reached forward and pressed the button herself. The moment her finger tapped the control panel, the transmission shot outward like a pulse of light, bouncing between unregistered satellites, pirate networks, and public access feeds. It was unstoppable. Vandross couldn't silence it now, and in that instant, everything changed. The first response. The reaction was almost immediate. Within minutes, emergency messages started lighting up the station's network. Vandross was scrambling. Ethan watched, arms crossed, as corporate security forces moved through the docks, their comms buzzing with frantic, encrypted chatter. They were trying to contain the fallout. Too late. Across the station, people were receiving the files, watching in shock as the truth spread like wildfire. Vandross hadn't just been moving cargo. They had been trafficking people, scientists, officials, prisoners who were supposed to be dead. And now, their secret was broadcasted across the entire sector. Lyra stepped beside him, her eyes locked onto the chaos unfolding in the docking bay. "This is just the beginning," she murmured. Ethan smirked. "Oh yeah, they're really gonna hate us for this." The final escape. The transmission had bought them a small window of time, but Ethan knew it wouldn't last. Vandross would send everything they had after them now. He turned to Lyra. "We need to get out of here. Now." She nodded, already moving toward her ship. "It's fueled and ready. Let's go." Ethan hesitated for only a second before following her up the ramp. As the ship's engines roared to life, security alarms blared across the station. The docking bay doors opened to the void of space, and Ethan took the co-pilot seat, scanning the starport's defense grid. "We've got 2 interceptors coming up on our tail," he muttered. Lyra's hands flew over the controls. "Then let's outrun them." The ship blasted forward, ripping away from the station just as the first shots fired past their hull. Ethan grinned, adrenaline surging. "Not bad, princess. Not bad." Lyra glanced at him. "I told you I'm not a princess." He smirked. "Yeah? Then why does it feel like we just overthrew a kingdom?" She laughed, genuinely laughed, and for the first time since this mess started, Ethan felt something else too. Hope. As their ship vanished into the black void of space, leaving behind the burning chaos of Navarra Starport, Ethan knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the end of their story. It was only the beginning. Epilogue. Wanted, alive, and dangerous. Days later, as they drifted in the safety of deep space, Ethan leaned back in the cockpit, arms crossed as he watched the latest news feeds. Their names were everywhere. Vandross had put out a bounty on them, listing them as fugitives, cybercriminals, and corporate saboteurs. Ethan sighed. Well, that's new. Lyra leaned over his shoulder, scanning the reports. How much are we worth? Ethan scrolled down. Then he let out a low whistle. Damn, enough to retire. Lyra smirked. Too bad we're just getting started. Ethan chuckled. Yeah, I figured as much. She stepped back toward the controls. So, what's next? Ethan leaned forward, eyes flicking toward the vast, open stars ahead of them. Well, he said, we just pissed off one of the biggest corporations in the galaxy. The way I see it. He grinned. Thought we might as well make it count.